Ladies and gentlemen, now I will open several Q&A sessions, perhaps at least 2 sessions, or more if the time allows. So for the first session...
Can I have maybe 2 minutes to respond?
Oh, 2 minutes to respond to...
Yeah, I want to make a couple of points. Is that okay? Thank you. I wanted to say, I wanted to say thank you to both discussants for excellent comments. And I just wanted to touch on a couple of points that were raised by both discussions that I thought were really important, and I wanted to underscore. I'm not going to go through all of them, but a couple of things I wanted to mention. The first is, both of you raised the question of how do we think about programs that try to move people out of poverty versus programs that are trying to help people kind of where they are. And I think this is a really important issue. But I think that you're right to point out that some of these programs, like the graduation approach, sort of asset transfers, for the right subpopulation, very poor people, ability to use kind of these assets, entrepreneurial skill, can be very effective. But I don't think, my own perspective is, I think we also have to recognize that there are some people who are, for whatever reason, have low earning capacity and need assistance. And I don't think there's anything wrong with, as a society, I mean, obviously it's not for me to decide, but I think that, there's nothing wrong necessarily from an economic perspective to say there are certain classes of people for which the right approach is actually they need continued assistance kind of over time. And I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing. So I think that it's important to think through for what classes of people these graduation approaches can be effective, and to design programs for them, absolutely. But sometimes I think it's also to recognize there's other categories of people that may just need assistance kind of on an ongoing basis, and how do you design programs that meet that? So that's one point I wanted to make. The second point I wanted to make is, I wanted to emphasize this point of, should we continue updating the database about poverty targeting? And I mentioned this in my talk, but I want to say it again, because I think this point is often lost. On the one hand, updating the data is expensive in rupiah terms, but compared to the trillions of rupiah that are spent every year on social assistance, I think it was 100 trillion in your slides, actually the number I got from including some other programs that also use the UDP, like BPJS Kesehatan and whatever, is even higher, it's a couple 100 trillion. Per year, compared to that, the cost of figuring out who should get the transfers is a fraction of a percent. And it seems to me like in the same way we do the Susanas every year, and we do the Sakranas all the time, like we need to have a system of regularly scheduled data updating that would be, and that's going to be very cost effective. And so I think that that's very important to emphasize. And the third point, I wanted to say what Pak said about, building these kinds of evaluations into social programs is hard, and I think that is not true. I think that the most important point is you can actually build evaluations into programs if you start thinking about them when you design the program. The key point is thinking about the evaluation of the program at the design stage. Every program that is going to be piloted somewhere has a list of places where it's going to be piloted. You just have to, and that list is going to get drawn up somehow. And the key point is when you're drawing up that list, thinking about how you're going to evaluate it later on, years later, at that time. And if you do it up front, it's actually, of all the many, many challenges, that's not necessarily, drawing up that spreadsheet in the appropriate way is not necessarily the hardest challenge, but it requires thinking up front. So those are the 3 points I wanted to make. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'll return to Q&A sessions. For the first session here, we have 3 questions from the floor. Okay, one from my right, and okay, 3. There's 3 from my left. Okay, I will take 4. 1 from your right, 3, 1, 2, you and Ibu Lisa, 3. So altogether 4. So please tell your name and affiliations, ask your question as clear as possible, and to whom you would like to address the questions. First from the right.
Not really familiar with anything right now. I'm a big fan of yours, but and MTP. I really enjoyed reading the papers. But what I think is somewhat lacking from the discussion about this subject is the government's administration capacity to actually implement some of your proposed approaches. And while all of your papers are very rigorous technically, there has been pretty much no discussion on government capacity, and especially if we're talking about lessons from each of the world. And Indonesian government capacity in targeting is pretty good, and so if we can't do it, probably no other emerging economy would be able to do it. Now, I think your first papers on targeting was about 7 years ago. There has been a lot of discussion on changing targeting system in Indonesia, and nothing has changed so far, and mostly because once people always think that these are really good ideas, but once they sit down with Kemensos or Pemda for a few days, they started seeing that this is just administratively possible to do. So basically, I was just wondering whether there's any study that actually looks at the Indonesian government capacity to implement some of this stuff, because I understand that for instance, the study on community-based targeting, for instance, that did not involve actual Indonesian administration to implement the treatment. And anything that involves PMT involves BIES, and as I understand, BIES doesn't want to do that anymore, or at least does not want to get too involved in that. So again, if we look at that, if we also include, administrative feasibility into the equations, then when you start comparing really, improving targeting versus a more universal approach in poverty, in anti-poverty program, even if per household value is reduced significantly if you do a universal approach. But if you include administrative capacity into the equation, would you still be saying that it's still worth trying to fix targeting instead of going the other way?
Thank you. One, I'll take all the questions first. Second, from
Okay. My name is Indra Saputra. I'm from Polytechnic of Stan. Okay. Indonesia already have registrar that specific social assistance program, but right now we have a village fund policy, and some government agencies claim that we are reduce the poverty line by the kind of more general program. How to distinguish the effect from the more general and the specific program on the impact of reducing the poverty in Indonesia?
the question is addressed to
Mr.
Professor
Ben.
Okay, thank you.
The third question is, yes, sir, Lisa, please wait.
My name is Matias from STNI Kabudi, and I'm helping the Economy Rakyat. I think I want to direct to Professor Olken. Since you are a US professor, how do you relate to the Australian National University? That is just a personal question, and the second thing is, I look at your presentations about these blocks on page 90. You talk about the proxy means test, and then the number range from 10 to 70. That's there in rupiah. Is that in juta? And the middle is 13. Is that something to do with the? And also you mentioned about the UBI, universal basic income, which is one of the maybe another approach. But I don't see. I would like to see more slide order is. UBI in emerging when compared to US. If you see in US right now, it's like the Democratic Party and Julian also having the 1,000 cash for the, but that is not the emerging. How does it will be different from the industrial moves to the emerging when it comes to UBI?
Thank you. My name is Lisa from the faculty UI. Kudos and congratulations on the paper. I haven't read it, but I think it's a sum up of a number of different researches that research that looks at these different programs. And I think what's very uplifting and promising is the fact that you pointed out the short-term and long-term benefits of these cash transfer programs. Just a couple of questions to understand your presentation better. The 30,000 cash transfer that was used in the first research that you pointed out, where did that number come from? Was it a particular methodology? Was it based on previous studies? That's one. And then the second one is, as you correctly highlighted, or the fact that the challenge of doing a proxy means testing in a country like Indonesia and other emerging economies is that lack of data. I'm just wondering whether you have any experience or observation of, in an ideal world, what kind of questions would be good to have in certain censuses or questionnaires or surveys that would help the government conduct a proxy means testing that could perhaps reduce that 30%. And then the third question is, in terms of the types of assistances, were those compared across the different targeting processes, or were they a general observation in the sense that were those types of assistances, the cash the cash, the vouchers, and the in-kind, were they observed based on different targeting processes or not? Thank you.
Professor Bent?
Okay, great. These are all terrific questions. Let me tackle them. The first is the government administration capacity. So, I think that actually the government of Indonesia is remarkably good at implementing programs at scale, certainly compared to some other governments around the world. And I guess I want to note that although some of the projects I've talked about were not directly implemented by the government, some of them were. So, for example, in the PKH study, the long-run evaluation of PKH I mentioned, in fact, not only was that implemented by the government through the normal procedures, but actually the researchers had all stopped being involved after the second year completely, and it was just run by the government in a normal thing. We just happened to come back later, 6 years later, and see what happened. All those results are, with the government kind of running as is, as normal, with no hand-holding from any researchers at all. So I think that's actually an example of not just kind of what does things look like in the medium run, but what do they look like when run at scale kind of by the government. I think they're remarkably effective. Similarly, the cards example, the basic version of the cards treatment was, the cards get sent out in an envelope dropped in the mail from Jakarta, and see what happens. So that's something I think that was not, and then that was the real effects kind of without any additional information. Some of the additional treatments, like the public thing, that we had to facilitate, but the basic one of just drop the cards in the mail was totally scalable. And I think actually when the government scaled up the cards nationwide, they did a much better job making sure the cards reached people than we did in our experiment. So in our experiment, actually only about 30% of the cards reached the households. In subsequent survey data, we actually checked when the government mailed out the KPS, what fraction of eligible households received it, and it's close to 100% actually. So I think the idea that sort of when the government is doing stuff at scale, it's not going to be the same as what we do is not in general right. I do think that you're right to point out that some of the targeting challenges, it has been challenging, I think, to incorporate some of these ideas. I think there are protocols in place for incorporating community-based input into the targeting process, but I think that's probably not as, maybe not as effective yet as it possibly could be. So I think you're right to highlight these concerns. Part of the idea of the research is show where we should be going, but I think some of the other projects, I think, suggest that a lot of these results really can be happened when the government's doing stuff. The second question that came up from a couple of different questions was about UBIs and how do we think about UBIs and is targeting sort of worth it? And this is, as you mentioned, a major question of policy debate around the world. It's a big debate in India, it's a big debate in the US. And I guess I have 2 points. The first is, And for anyone who's interested in this, I suggest, I have a paper with Rima Hanna on this in the Journal of Economic Perspectives last year, which highlights these issues. There's a big difference, in my opinion, between a UBI in a developed country and a developing country. And the difference comes back to that same issue about who pays tax. Okay? So I don't know a chalkboard, but the big issue is, in a developed country like the US, everybody's in the tax net. So a UBI is not really actually universal. A UBI just means if you earn $0, you get something. But everything that happens after $0 is a function of the tax system. So that allows you a lot of flexibility to give transfers to the very bottom, but give a smaller net transfer as you move up the distribution. And that makes them less expensive. In a developing country like Indonesia, if the bottom, say 80% of the people are outside the tax net, that means that if you give a UBI, it's really giving the same rupiah transfer to the bottom 80%, because you can't tax it back, because you can't adjust the taxes of those people. So that means it's even more expensive in some sense, and even less, a UBI is even less redistributive or well targeted in an emerging economy because you're giving the same net transfer much further up the income distribution. So in terms of the question of how is it different here than in the US, that's I think the key distinction between how we think about those things. And if you're interested, we go through that argument in a lot of detail in that JEP paper. Is it worth it on net? You know, the actual sort of targeting performance in Indonesia is not perfect, but it's not bad either. And a lot of the simulations that we did in terms of thinking about the trade-offs were taking into account all the imperfections in targeting. So I think that the way, my bottom line is the trade-off between a UBI and a targeted transfer is this. With a targeted transfer, I think that you're delivering much higher assistance to the poor, okay? The main issue actually is exclusion error. Some of the poor are not gonna get it because the target isn't imperfect. And so the trade-off you have to face is between, do you want to give a lot of assistance to a lot of very poor people, but have some people be left out? Or do you want to give a very small amount of assistance to everybody and then nobody left out? And in terms of, you know, how do you make that trade-off? That's a trade-off between those two different types of things, and it's sort of hard to sort of figure out how to weigh those, but that is the trade-off to make. Then the third question was about the, how do you separate out the effects of these programs from other things? That's what the randomized trials are really helpful for, because the other things are sort of similar across the different areas. And so that you kind of hold constant, like the fact that randomization is there, and compare one program to another. So that's very helpful for separating things out. And then finally, you had some specific questions. Where did the 30,000 come from? It was like it was an amount of money that we could have. At that time, we weren't working with a big government program. It was the amount of money we could afford to give out. It was about 1.5 days' wages for the typical poor person in Busan. So that's where it came from. But it's an important point because when we presented the results and we found no elite capture, one of the responses from Bapanas actually was, well, you weren't giving out that much money. When you give out real money, that's when the elite capture will end. But that's when we said, okay, you really think that's true? Why don't we replicate this in Tekaha, where there's real money at stake? And we did. And we actually found kind of very similar results. So I think that's also an example of an iterative process. Try it for small amounts of money first. If it looks good, then you can try it for higher stakes. And that's what we do. You asked some other, the questions about whether the types of stuff was holding the targeting, that was holding kind of the targeting constant. And you know, the final question is, how do you reduce the exclusion error at the very bottom? You know, I think this is really hard. I don't think there are additional questions I would put on the survey, because in fact, when we did the experiment, we were looking for what additional questions to add, like the TD and the what. And part of the reason, actually one of the big challenges we had was coming up with good questions, because the questions are already pretty good. So there's not like a lot of obvious improvements that I can, there are a few things here or there, but not major improvements. And actually the question of how do you get that exclusion error from the very poor down is a really, I think that actually that, to me, that we have some approaches, you know, adding some community verification in, allowing some slots. I mean, the first thing I would do is allow some extra slots for each community to say, oh, you missed so-and-so, put them in. That's the first thing I would do. And having an on-demand application process so people who weren't even interviewed, have them be able to apply to. Those are the two things from the research I would do. Beyond that, I think it's a really, really hard problem. The data is just imperfect.
Thank you. We have plenty of time left. So may I open the second questions and answer sessions? Another 3 or 4 questions from the floor. And as Professor Burns notified, you can use any of you who would like to ask in Indonesia is welcome. Okay, 2 or 3 already, 3 from the left. And may I have questions from the right? In Indonesia? In Indonesian is okay? Oh, 4 from the lady on the back. So 4 questions. Farizal first.
Thank you.
Then Professor Mani. And first the gentleman here and the lady up there.
I haven't read the paper yet, but anyway, I'm going to ask you 2 things. First of all, is there any particular or peculiar Indonesian political economy or institutions that actually make the entire poverty programs work to some extent in Indonesia? That one. The second one will be like, how do you actually get government ear for the evidence-based policy, or even for more particular research method will be in doing RCT? That's probably the question. Well, my name is Rizal from Leiden, used to be former with the LPA.
Professor Mani.
Chris Manning, associated with the ANU. I really enjoyed your talk, Ben, and all the presentation. I wanted to ask a question that's sort of a little bit political economy oriented. Early on in these programs, as I recall, there was a lot of criticism, particularly from politicians. I think John Maxwell wrote a paper early on and pointed out some of the criticisms of these programs, saying, well, you know, people are lazy, you know, economic growth is going to solve the problem. Why go to all this trouble? Reflecting on the 14 years that you've been working on this, do you think those attitudes have changed? Do you think, let's say, an opposition group, is it much smaller now? Do you think you've convinced the political community that this really is the way to go? I'm very convinced that probably most people in this room are, but I wonder whether it spreads that wide.
So I will take the question from the gentleman on the first row.
Thank you. My name is Dylan. I'm from MOSA. So actually, I have like 2 questions. The first one is regarding your comparison between BLT, community-based, and self-enrollment in housing. So I just want to ask whether you have like some kind of like cornerstones or something like that, in which the PMT only you know, work in some places compared to the other method. Like for example, when we visit like village with high TKI, you know, like people so just come back from working from Malaysia or Arab or something like that, and they build their home, they have like quite good assets, and when you do the PMT, they have like a high score, while actually they don't have like a decent job in this village, so it becomes like high, you know, pretty high error for the PMT one. And for the second one is like, so you mentioned about the self-enrollment actually, self-assessment actually is like kind of the best one compared to the other one, if it's like, you know, facilitated through the facilitators.
in this, if I'm not mistaken, that's the argument. But then in your paper, it is the self-enrollment actually helped through the PKH facilitator, in which they, they can have like this, the hand comes to the beneficiaries like directly. But for other program in which has like, not so many facilitators, how can how can actually the government conduct the self-assessment targeting? That's the question.
Yes, thank you. One more questions. From the lady at the back. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Eva. Actually, I just would like to ask you a question. How can you explain more about limited resources means that targeting the right beneficiaries is crucial? Will the survey at household level can present more reliable data? Thank you.
I didn't quite understand the question.
Could you repeat your questions one more time? Thank you.
You explained that the limited resources means that targeting the right beneficiaries is crucial. Limited resources means that targeting the right beneficiaries is crucial. But I'm thinking that whether the survey at the household level can present more reliable data in providing the assistance. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna go. Great. Okay, thank you very much for these great questions. There were several questions about political economy. So, this is a tough question. First question is there anything about the Indonesian political economy in particular that's different? So, the political economy everywhere is always challenging. I actually think some of these issues are more general. One issue that comes up a lot is, in the design of food assistance in particular, is the role of gulag and the interaction between their macroeconomic objective of sort of having some stabilization of rice prices and the microeconomic objective of targeting the poor. And sometimes those objectives aren't always exactly the same. I used to think this was an Indonesian political economy, particular Indonesian political economy problem, but I learned something very interesting recently when I was doing some reading about the history of the food stamps program in the United States. And it turns out that the US had essentially exactly the same situation. So in the 1930s, they had an agricultural surplus during the Great Depression, where they had low agricultural prices. The government wanted to do macroeconomic price support and buy up a lot of agricultural products. And then they said, well, what do we do with it? And they said, oh, maybe we should give it to the poor. And that was the initial kind of US government welfare program. And then it was only 30 years later that or 20 years later, that they replaced that with a voucher system, where the poor could actually buy the food from wherever they wanted. And actually, in the US, the food assistance program for the poor is run by the Department of Agriculture for this historical reason. So why do I give you this story? On the one hand, I used to think that this tension between gulag and the ministry and the social side of this was very Indonesia-specific political economy problem, but it's not. I think this question of where does the food come? We have this extra food. What do we do with it? Is actually a very fundamental issue that comes up in a lot of different contexts. So that doesn't mean that there's an easy solution or an obvious answer to those questions, but it gave me some perspective that the experience that I think Indonesia is going through now is common, I think, probably, and that those challenges are really more fundamentally linked than at least I had realized. I thought it was really, reading that history, I was like, oh, that's so fascinating. I feel like that's what I'm reading about today, and it's the same thing in the US, a while ago. Another really interesting question is, another political economy question is, people are lazy, teach them how to fish, don't give them a fish, etc. I have two comments on that. The first is, we got this question all the time. Do all these programs make people lazy? And I kept saying, I don't think so. But then we finally got fed up and wrote a paper about it. Because we really realized there wasn't as good evidence as we thought. So we found 7 different randomized trials from around the world of cash assistance programs, including PKH in Indonesia, and looked at the impact on labor supply. And we find nothing. Okay, so these programs do not seem to reduce labor supply. So, you know, we wrote that up. It's gotten some press. Has it convinced the world? I don't know, maybe not. But you know, there's only so much I can do. But I do think that that message is really important. And I think that we were actually talking about this last night as well. I think that part of the confusion comes from, part of the issue comes from the fact that people confuse price effects from income effects. Some programs where if you work more, you're going to lose the benefits very quickly, those programs do discourage work. And that's because they have very strong price effects, right? If you work, it's like a tax. If you work more, you're going to lose the benefits. That's a big tax. That's going to discourage work. But most of these programs in emerging economies are much closer to pure income grants. It's like you're eligible for PKH. We give you the transfer for the next 6 years. After that, it's kind of unclear what's going to happen. In any way, sort of the relationship between your labor supply and whether you're eligible in the unified database is pretty complicated anyway. So the effective tax rate is pretty small. So they're much more like pure income effects, and the income effect on labor supply actually is theoretically ambiguous, and in practice just seems to be pretty small. So, you know, has it changed the political economy? I don't know. I think that you do hear maybe less of that than you did initially. I think these programs were, seem to have more staying power, actually. They seem to be sticking around. So, you know, unlike sort of the, you know, for whatever reason, the BLT or BLT, you know, the Bundle Lunch and Tonight programs, those didn't seem to have a lot of staying power, but some of the other programs do. And so, you know, just looking at that as kind of what's the equilibrium political economy, it seems like the direct cash programs seem to be a harder sell, but the rest of them seem to be pretty stable. So maybe that's the answer. You asked a question about how do you get the government to do it? It's hard. I think it's a reflection of a lot of investment over time, finding the right champions in government who are interested, making sure people understand this. I think we've been very fortunate to have a number of people in government who have been very supportive of this at all different levels of government. And working with those people and using that as an opportunity to build this. And I think once you have one success, then it's easier to go to the next government agency and say, look, we've worked with, you know, those 6 government agencies. Maybe that helps us say more credibly we can work with you as well. It also requires, I think, building some trust about sort of showing how, you know, researchers can be useful and sort of answering some of their questions, you know, before you sort of go directly to the thing. And the final thing, which is really important, which I think is listening and being, as a researcher, if I just come in and say, I want to run this study, they'll be like, no, I don't want to run that study, and that doesn't go anywhere. And sort of listening to what the real problems are, and looking for the intersection between what is really policy relevant here and what is also relevant for me as sort of an international researcher that's also going to be useful kind of globally. Looking for that intersection requires sort of listening and being adaptive, and I think that's really important too. And then the final questions were about, you know, heterogeneity. It's a good question. You know, your example of TKI is really interesting. You know, I think that's an example where the community-based approach can really help because the community might have more information. I think that we've done some cuts on heterogeneity in our data, like urban versus rural, and it seems like we don't have major differences there. It's hard to capture all the heterogeneity in the world, and one of the advantages of the community-based approach is it can allow the communities to use that. So I mean, I think that, you know, starting with the PMT approach, but allowing a little bit of slack for the community to make adjustments can be very effective, particularly to address exclusion error. To me, can be very relevant. And then in terms of reliable data from the households, actually I think that, you know, data is not perfect. There's always measurement error, but I think that, you know, it's pretty reasonable, I think, as well.
Okay. I think we are coming to the end of the sessions. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to thank once again to our distinguished speakers and discussants for the great presentations, and to the audience for your kind and active participation. So to close the sessions, let's give ourselves and the three presenters a big round of applause. Now I return the floor to the organizers. Good afternoon. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.